Hello and welcome. This is Business Edge right here on News Central. I'm Tolulope. Adeleru-Balogun. Our headline stories take us to the southern parts of the continent. South Africa may be edging closer to a tax revolt. And the government has also announced plans to revive the economy using Operation Vulindlela. We'll have the details of this. Now, the 2021 budget speech, which was delivered by the Minister of Finance, Tito in Mboweni in February, hit the right notes in preferring economic growth over raising taxes as a means to increase tax revenue. This continued a steady theme from previous budget speeches, which acknowledged South Africa's relatively high tax rates and the inverse relationship between higher rates and increased tax revenues. But that is not all there is to South Africa's tax conversation. Also, in a bid to revive the economy, the government plans to use Operation Vulindlela as a way to get out of the rut. How will all of this play out? That's what we're talking about today. Welcome. This is Business Edge. South Africa's Institute of Race Relations has cautioned that the country's tax base is reaching an alarming point as the government increasingly looks for new ways to amass revenue. The think tank sent a memo to President Cyril Ramaphosa earlier this month explaining that the government's increased revenue burden on taxpayers was a form of citizen abuse and that many South Africans would look to form of a tax revolt to escape the increasing cost. Now, although some forms of tax revolt, such as the refusal to pay e-tolls, have already been demonstrated, some have deemed a full tax revolt impossible, citing SARS collection abilities and the way other taxes are calculated into so many things. The group further said that the citizens who remain in the country will increasingly turn away from the government and its services, instead relying on their own efforts and communities. The IRR research points to the fact that the tax burden on South Africans has risen to the highest levels in the history of the country, and that many families pay more than half of their income towards tax levies and secondary and tertiary taxes. The IRR also warns that a large proportion of households have reached a point of crisis, with many no longer able to afford basic services, foodstuffs, school fees, or even to settle their debts. Joining me on the show is researcher and economist based in Lusaka, Zambia, Mtwalo Msoni. Mtwalo, welcome to the show once again. Thank you so much for joining me. Now, PricewaterhouseCoopers has warned that South Africa is heavily reliant on income and direct taxes, most of which are coming from a declining base of taxpayers. It is also estimated that just about 25% of those who pay income tax pay 80% of all personal income tax that is even collected. So first question, where have South Africa's taxpayers gone? Why is there a decreasing tax base in South Africa?
It's because of the circumstances that we're in. We are in the middle of the pandemic. The economy is not generating as much income as it was before. There are not as many jobs as there were before we entered the pandemic, and there have been very little increases in terms of the incomes of different households. In announcing the 2021-2022 budget, of course, there was mention to say that the increase in tax would not come from personal income per se, but would broadly be based on increases in excise duty on alcohol consumption and tobacco products, as well as 27 cents on the price of fuel per liter. So there has been very minimal increases in terms of what is collected in tax, and we do know that tax instruments have been underperforming because of the decline in economic activity. The projection for tax collection in 2021 is around 1.21 trillion rands, which falls short of about 231 billion in terms of what was projected in 2020 before we knew that we're going to be in the middle of the pandemic right now. So there is just little money that is coming into government coffers, and it's mainly because of the decline in economic activities, and mainly because government did not take action to try to increase its revenue sources when entering into 2021. It was only the two that I have mentioned that faced some form of increase.
Okay, but in terms of those facing a form of increase, this declining tax base has been a part of the conversation in South Africa for a number of years, even before the pandemic came, even before the latest recession as well, even before these unfortunate unemployment figures. So we're hearing that a tax revolt is a form of protest against corruption or wasteful expenditure by government. This is what the Institute of Race Relations says may happen because of the tax burden that South Africans are carrying. Other than some of the smaller ways people have been skirting taxes, do you think that a tax revolt can happen in South Africa?
Well, so besides areas of tax representation, repricing, and of course, what has to do with redistribution, there's a broader conversation on where the tax burden lies. And this is the argument that the IRR has in place to say the burden is lying heavily on the middle income and lower income individuals who are no longer affording basic necessities because they're paying so much in terms of tax. But other than that, what can also lead to a revolt is the fact that if you're not seeing where the money is going, you're contributing to the tax base, yet not benefiting from essential services, you'd rather evade tax, use the money for something else because it would be seeming that you are contributing to something that does not benefit you, does not benefit your family, and does not benefit the nation at large. A tax revolt would be possible in the case where there's literally nothing to show for the expenditures that are coming from tax relief. Currently, there's lots of dedication from the South African government to spend lots of revenue towards COVID relief. We heard about 10 billion rands being spent on COVID vaccines, and most of the people in South Africa will access these vaccines for free. So hopefully, if people can be able to relate better to where this tax that is being collected goes, we won't see a tax revolt happening in South Africa. And another issue, of course, if people feel less burdened by the tax, probably if there's a form of increase in income, a decline in the consumption basket of essential goods and services, then won't be able to see this revolt. This revolt can come into place even if there was no increase in personal income tax, because most of the taxes that were increased in terms of the 27% per litre of fuel and in terms of the 8% excise duty on consumption of alcohol and tobacco products, regressive taxes in the sense that they affect those who have and do not have the same way, essentially increasing the cost of the basic needs basket for the ordinary person, increasing the cost of the basic needs basket for someone who traditionally consumes goods.
Okay. No, let's also talk about who is paying tax as well. Now, we know South Africa has faced a great deal of economic and political uncertainty in recent months, with claims of state capture, corruption, and cronyism marring government. Some leaders and political analysts have even suggested that more corruption of tax revolt, that when you see more corruption in the country, you see conversations around tax revolt. What has the government done to address these issues that are affecting tax willingness? Because when we talk about people having to pay tax, you've mentioned that people also want to see their tax at work. But when they're hearing that money, public funds have been siphoned off, have been misappropriated, have been misused, it reduces their willingness to pay the taxes. So what is government doing to address these issues?
Well, besides the increasing measures taken by SARS, the Revenue Authority, to ensure increase in compliance of tax payments, what we've seen happening in South Africa is a mushrooming of different development plans, that are trying to show how the nation will recover from the current coronavirus pandemic that we're in. So there are so many plans, a plan on how to get people into employment, on how to get the different economic sectors working. There's a whole plan on how to recover from the COVID pandemic. And if the government can be able to demonstrate that some of these revenues that have been collected in tax are financing these plans and the plans are yielding necessary results, we're seeing people get employed, we're seeing inflation contained, we're seeing lower rates of borrowing money and increase in business activity, then the government will get away with a looming tax revolt and resilience from people to pay. People will be resistant to pay tax when they feel that the burden is extremely large and when they cannot see the benefits. So if they're able to be convinced that the tax is being collected in a progressive manner, in essence, being collected fairly in the sense that the poor are paying less, the more well-to-do are paying more, and everyone is paying a fair share contribution to development, and these funds are not ending up in the hands of a few, but are contributing to the necessary welfare of the country, then you can convince a taxpayer to continue complying with their tax payment
Yes.
as it were.
Very true.
Because of the pandemic.
So let's go back to the IRR reports. It also highlighted that the fact that there is a high number of South Africa's wealthy who have now left the country. And this is something that has also been lamented by the Treasury as it has lost out on tax revenue from high net worth individuals. So you also said earlier that the burden right now for taxes in South Africa is mainly coming from the middle class. In 2019, the World Bank recognized South Africa as the most unequal country in the world, meaning that the economy does not equally benefit all of its citizens. The bank also reported that the richest 20% of people in the country control almost 70% of the resources. When we have conversations about taxes, we have to talk about those who are at the higher spectrum of the tax bracket. So what is happening with South Africa's wealthy?
Well, first of all, there's very weak implementation and actual realization of wealth taxes around the world. Wealth taxation has been something that has been talked about. It's a heated conversation in South Africa on whether it can work. There's a basic difference between wealth and income. Income is the money that probably comes in from the day-to-day job, your day-to-day hustle, your business, and the like. Wealth is more like something that you hold, probably some real estate capital that you have. The more progressive form of taxation is obviously to target wealth, because people who have high incomes might not be as wealthy as some of the people in countries. So once we get to tax wealth, then we can probably say we have a more progressive system that's targeting those who are better off and well-to-do. It goes beyond just taxing some of the dividends or the returns of their assets. So in essence, my argument is that I think probably South Africa is more of experiencing a loss in high net income individuals and not necessarily net worth individuals, because wealth, if left in South Africa, of course, will be transferable to another individual. If your wealth is built in South Africa, you've got so many buildings as we are seeing on the screen, then you'd probably sell them to someone else. The wealth is maintained in country. So I would argue probably we're losing out on high income individuals and not necessarily the wealthy, because these are replaced, and even if they move from one country to another, the wealth might be maintained in country. More progressive form of taxation, of course, is to target people who have the wealth and not necessarily income, because there's a huge disparity between the high income earners who are seasonal to some extent and the people who are extremely wealthy. So a wealth tax, for example, will look at the most wealthy South Africans, even about 200 of them, and tax them just a 1%. Believe me, this will be way more income that we realize than having another tax band or high high-earning individuals.
Okay, Mtwalo, let's take a break. We'll wrap up this part of the conversation because we also have to talk about the fact that what are the solutions that South Africa needs to look at. And then we'll also make sure we touch base with Operation Vulindlela that the government has announced as its way out of its economic situation. So just hold on. We will be right back. This is Business Edge. Do stay with us. This is still Business Edge, and before we move into another conversation that is happening in South Africa, let's wrap up this conversation on taxes. Now, the country has a problem, many people agree, with a narrow tax base and high taxes. South Africa has almost 7 million taxpayers out of a population of 60 million. Recently, unemployment reached 32.5% of the workforce between October and December of 2020, the highest level since record keeping began in 2008. Mtwalo, please tell me and tell those who are watching, what is the way out for South Africa on this tax situation? It was a good thing that the finance minister did not mention that there would be increases in taxes, but still there are many, many issues around it. So what is the solution? 1 or 2 or 3?
First solution is to increase compliance. So your instruments, your tax instruments, are only more useful than the paper they're written on to the extent that they're implemented. So if you increase tax compliance by ensuring that what's enshrined in the legislative framework is being followed by the taxpayers, you have cost audits for the different taxpayers, especially the large taxpayers. You'd be able to deal with some of the tax evasion or potential tax avoidance that would be happening. That's one. The second one is looking at broadening your tax base by targeting higher income earners. You make your tax systems more progressive. The poorer pay nothing. The people who are in the probably low middle class pay very little. The extremely wealthy pay a higher burden. This is basic progressive taxation, and you can make your tax system overall more progressive by introducing tax instruments like a wealth tax, have a fixed registry for the extremely wealthy, and have them contribute more to the revenue base. The third one is try to show and exhibit that the tax that is being collected is being put to good use.
Okay.
People are more generally likely to try to avoid pay tax if they do not see where the income they are contributing is going to.
Yeah, you mentioned that before. Very true. So let's quickly touch on this before we wrap things up. The South African government has announced plans to revive the economy. Now, the National Treasury has published its updated Operation Vulindlela plan. That means make way. And it outlines the government's strategy to boost the economy after the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the joint initiative of the presidency and the National Treasury is a government-wide approach through which ministers, departments, entities, ministries enforce structural reforms, and a unit in the presidency and National Treasury monitors progress and actively supports implementation. So the big question would be, this seems like a fresh breeze of air that seems to be blowing through the government. It's raising people's hopes that things will be done differently. Well, some people anyway. And there are those who are questioning whether President Cyril Ramaphosa can really convince a skeptical public that things will be different this time around. Mtwalo, tell me what you think. What can this operation with this unit that's going to be headed with the presidency and the National Treasury, what can it really achieve for South Africa?
Well, the operation in basic terms seeks to look at the sectors which are enablers for the smooth running of the economy, for quick growth, and try to see how you can get these up to speed. Amongst the sectors that are looking at is the electricity generation sector. Of course, we do know South Africa has had deficits, just like its neighbors, Zambia and Zimbabwe, electricity generation. And electricity is an essential factor to the production of goods and services. An economy cannot operate without power. It will not operate at its optimum capacity. And this is one of the things that are being looked at. So it's looking at how we can speed up the process and ensure that the plans that are enlisted and enablers for economic recovery and economic recovery plans actually put in place and been implemented swiftly and fastly. Electricity generation, communication are some of these enablers that need to be in place for an economy to recover, as well as the transport sector, which is listed in this plan. So it's only as useful as it is implemented as well.
Okay, and it's a good thing you mentioned implementation, but because I think like many other African countries, the issue is not necessarily the policies. The issue is the policy implementation and the detail. Is there strong belief that with the National Treasury, with the presidency, with the units overseeing this, that the minutia, the details that need to be looked at to make these things happen, that they will be taken care of?
Well, looking at the plan itself, I think it's something that tries to achieve long-term outcomes over a short term. There's lots that is missing in terms of its operation plan. Of course, you do know that the intermediate structures that are supposed to be in between the Treasury and the President to operate. But other than that, I think most of what's entrusted in the plan has to do with infrastructure development. And if the infrastructure development is slow-paced during the pandemic period, then you are very unlikely to see this pan out in the short term. Yeah. So for electricity, for example, some of the plans are to rehabilitate existing plants that are there, to build new plants to increase electricity generation, to be that enabling factor for the economy. So if you have the rehabilitation works happening quite slowly because of limited funding that's going to, and slow pace of work during COVID periods, then you are very likely to have even a larger lag of the short term when it has long-term outcome.
All right. Mtwalo Msoni, I'll end the conversation here, but we'll, of course, be following pace with the developments in Africa's most industrialized economy. Thank you so much for joining me on Business Edge.
Thank you. Pleasure for me.
All right. Let's move straight to wrapping things up on the show today with nothing else but NC4 to watch. Fitch Ratings says the South African economy will expand. Some good news there, by 4.3% in 2021 and 2.5% in 2022 as it continues on a path of moderate recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. It had earlier downgraded the country into junk status in November 2020. The ratings agency, which has a BB- sovereign rating on SA's debts with a negative outlook, lifted its economic growth forecast from a previous estimate of 3.6 last mentioned when it issued a note after Finance Minister Tito Mboweni's speech. Moving from there, the Debt Management Office has listed the 162.557 billion 7-year federal government of Nigeria Ijara Sukuk. It comes with a rate of 11.2% on the floor of the Nigerian Exchange Limited. The Central Bank of Kenya has accepted bids worth 23.3 billion Kenyan shillings from this week's Treasury bills auction held on Thursday. The government's fiscal agent received bids amounting to 27.3 billion Kenyan shillings from investors against its offer of T-bills worth 24 billion Kenyan shillings at the auction. And finally, Moroccan mining company Managem has signed an announced partnership with the Wambao Mining Group for the development of a gold extraction numerous projects in Sudan. Now, according to a press statement, the mining company has acquired 65% of a stake in Block 15, also known as the Gaba gold mine in Sudan. And that's it on this edition of Business Edge. As always, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to follow us on social media at News Central TV for more news and stories. Head to our website for any of the information you may have missed. And our YouTube channel is there for you to watch previous editions of Business Edge. Until next time, I'm Tolulope, Adeleru-Balogun. Do have a pleasant weekend.